Oh, thank you.
And I have to thank you for a number of things. You've retweeted me a couple of times. I mean, mostly I pay attention to the radio show podcast, but there was a tweet I did from the ULA facility when I was visiting Alabama not too long ago, and had a spectacular tour. Thank you for a number including of things. The new line that is putting together your new Vulcan rocket a couple of absolutely times. Fascinating. I'm hoping we can get to that a little bit later to the radio show podcast. But I know that you also have a little bit of a presentation for ULA facility, and if you want to do that now, then we'll come back. Alabama not too long ago. I'll throw you some of my questions, and we'll take some from some folks who are participating in the summit line that is putting together your
okay, that sounds great.
Absolutely fascinating. I'm hoping we can get to that a little bit later to the radio show.
But if we can bring the charts up, I'll start with that, and then I'm happy to do Q&A for ULA
facility. And if you want to do that now, then we'll come back. Not too long ago. I'll throw you some of my questions, and we'll take some.
Thank you for a number of hold on for a moment, please, folks. Sorry. Give us just a moment.
Looks like a little bit of a there, or maybe it's being fixed here. While we're waiting, I'll mention that Tory was honored. He gave the von Karman Lecture in Astronautics for AIAA, and was awarded the Wernher von Braun Memorial Award by the National Space Society. Pretty prestigious awards. And then now, Tory, I think we've got your slides.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm very flattered that you knew that, and I was extremely flattered by those organizations to be recognized. All right. Well, I have just a couple of slides. Let's go to the very next one. So what I have here is a listing of all of our missions that were interplanetary. And really the message here is, of course, first off, we're super proud that we've been able to go to every planet in the solar system and even the sun 2 times. But the real message is that after this initial pass by humanity of understanding our solar system, at least robotically, that we know that there are 2 places we really want to go with people. And of course, those 2 places are the moon and ultimately Mars, with really the moon playing an important role in getting to Mars. So let's go to the next slide, talk a little bit about the moon and maybe a little bit about why it's kind of in a way on the way to Mars. So what I've got here that I thought would be helpful to folks is a somewhat simplified version of a NASA slide that talks about the Artemis architecture. And what it is showing you is that final end state where we have an orbiting space station that they call the Gateway in a near rectilinear halo orbit around the moon, which is a very special orbit. It's one of the Lagrange point orbits, so it takes very little energy to keep this space station there, but it's also tilted such that it gives very easy access to the south pole of the moon, and it's in continuous communication with the Earth. So it's really an ideal place for this particular mission set that is envisioned. And of course, the big SLS with the very large Lockheed Orion spacecraft will bring people to that gateway. They will inhabit it for long periods of time, doing research, robotically controlling spacecraft that are on the surface of the moon, but also, and maybe most exciting and most importantly, they will board a craft periodically and descend down to the surface of the moon. And that's what you see up there where it says lander. So that's a very Apollo-like descender-ascender vehicle combination, but it does have this little transfer vehicle, kind of like a tug, that will take it from the very high altitude NRHO orbit down to a low lunar orbit, where then they can coast around to get in line with the desired landing spot for that particular mission, then descend, do a mission on the moon with people, and then get back on board and be brought all the way back to the space station. So what is interesting about the moon and why I'm talking about the moon in a Mars summit is because the moon really is on the way to Mars, not necessarily physically in terms of where you would go, but how we get to Mars safely with people. Now, the moon is interesting in its own right because of maybe two things. The technological research that it's going to afford us to safely transport humans there, but also the moon itself has natural resources. It has tremendous quantities of ice, of water, which is propellant, which if not initially, later will make it practical to send people routinely to and from Mars, because the propellant to get them there can be sourced in space and placed in locations that are easily accessed by future missions to and from Mars. And so it all really ties together. There's a couple of big challenges in sending people to Mars, and that is, of course, the incredible length of time it takes to get there. Any practical Mars mission is not going to be less than 2 years. And in that time, our astronauts are exposed to micro and low gravity for a very, very long period of time, much longer than we now understand from research on the Earth space station, the ISS, that would lead to health effects if it's not mitigated in some way. And then also we're in deep space, so very unlike the ISS, we're outside the Earth's ionosphere, and we are exposing people on a Mars mission to something on the order of 10 times the cancer risk threshold. So if they're not mitigated or shielded or protected in some way, it's really not necessarily a safe journey. And so the moon, 3 days away from Earth, affords us the location to go and do that research and develop the technologies that can mitigate those effects, both of radiation, microgravity, and there are others, where it's safe and we have an easy return to the Earth, and it's more practical to take materials to and from to experiment on before we commit to the big journey to Mars. So that's really why the moon is vitally important and interesting when we talk about the human exploration of Mars. Go to the next slide, please, and we'll talk just about Mars a little bit more. So these are our many missions, our 20 missions out to Mars, and they've taught us all sorts of interesting things. We now know that there's underground water on Mars. We understand much of the geology of certain locations on Mars. That helps us identify the most interesting places to send our people to Mars. It's not just enough to go there, put some boot prints in Martian red soil and plant a flag. We want to have a sustained human presence eventually, and we want to do some really interesting science when we're there. So all of these missions have contributed to understanding where we might find signs of ancient Martian life, which would be a giant moment in human history to actually know that life in some form has existed elsewhere than Earth. That's a big moment for humanity, as well as the best places to land and what's the geology like, what is the weather like, all the things that we need to know to first send people there safely and back, but really eventually to build habitats and be there on a permanent basis. Now, the other interesting thing I thought I might convey is that little tiny graphic in the corner, which people who are interested in Mars and Mars enthusiasts have probably seen a million times, but that is the orbital journey from Earth out to Mars. But I want to talk a little bit about how interesting and difficult and in some ways exotic that is. So the blue circle in the center, that's the orbit of the Earth around the sun. Mars is, of course, that red orbit on the outside. And about every 26 months, the two planets will pass. And that's when we have our opportunity to go. So when the Earth is gaining on Mars and about to pass it, we are able to launch our spacecraft out on that green trajectory, which is what we call a Hohmann transfer. That's a practical orbit to get to Mars. Unfortunately, Kepler, he's a bit of a tyrant. He doesn't let us just fly radially straight out to Mars. That wouldn't be too bad, only a scant 34 million miles if we could do that, but we can't. And so even though that sounds like an incredibly large number, the path that you traverse to roll along that green Hohmann transfer to Mars is much, much further. And in fact, you're aiming at a point in the Martian orbit millions of miles ahead of Mars, obviously, when you launch, and you glide out there as Mars is catching up to your spacecraft. And really, in a way, Mars kind of runs into your spacecraft or captures it by intersecting that transfer orbit, which is 230 million miles long. Just an incredibly unfathomable distance for a human to really grasp. And somebody asked me on Twitter one time, what would that be equivalent to in sort of human terms, something we could relate to? So I got out my calculator and my engineering pad, and I did some rough calcs, and it is roughly equivalent to being in Paris on the back of a flatbed truck, going down a highway at about 60 miles an hour. You hit a golf ball, it goes around the planet Earth and lands a hole-in-one out somewhere in Pasadena. So a pretty hard thing to do. It takes incredible precision and precise timing, and that is what we've done for 20 different missions and did just recently. Thank you for remembering, on Mars Perseverance. And during all of that time, if we send people, they've got to be in this tiny little tin can for a journey to Mars that's anywhere from 6 months to a year long, and then that much longer back after spending a year on the planet, and we've got to keep them safe and healthy through that whole thing. All right, let's go to the next slide, because this is a little bit about Perseverance, because I thought that would be, I think I'm trying to go to that one. There we go, thank you. That is a little bit about how complicated this is, even for just a robotic mission. So on this slide, on the top photo, you see the Perseverance spacecraft about to be encapsulated in that Atlas V payload fairing. The very distinctive blue panels you see are acoustic protection. Those are materials that absorb sound energy, because the sound of the air rushing on the outside of the payload fairing during the rocket's supersonic flight, as well as the sound that reflects off the Earth when we first launch, would be enough, if unmitigated, to actually damage and break that spacecraft. And on the left, you can see near the bottom kind of a big square. That's an access door, because being a Martian mission that needed a lot of electrical power, and remember that Mars is just about the edge of where solar power is practical for many applications, and in this particular case, it just wasn't. And so that spacecraft was powered by an RTG, a radioisotope thermal generator. It had 11 pounds of plutonium in a battery that powered it. And that hatch is there because we needed to install that battery very late in flow, after the spacecraft was already mated to the top of the rocket, for practical reasons involved in handling that much plutonium. But at this point, we have a highly sterile, very, very clean spacecraft because of our planetary protection protocols that say, hey, let's not just immediately go to another planet in the solar system like Mars, where we might be looking for signs of current or ancient life, and proceed to, spread bacteria and viruses all over the surface. So that's what we mean by planetary protection. All of this is clean and sterile. And today, for this mission, we've even had new protocols or new standards that were much, much more stringent than anything we've done in the past. And so after sterilizing the spacecraft, sealing under the payload fairing, bringing it out, putting it on top of this giant rocket inside our vertical integration facility, which protects the rocket from the weather, but really, for all intents and purposes, is basically outdoors, then we open a hatch. And so the picture directly below it is a portable clean room with high purity and positive pressure that actually was installed on the side of the rocket when it's inside that giant, essentially outdoor facility, so that we could do all of that safely, handle the plutonium, do all of the things we need to do, and then eventually have that launch. And of course, all of that with that outrageous precision, and in the middle of COVID, where I had
I'm sorry, attendees, we're having some audio issues. Please stand by while we get our presenters back online. attendees, we're having our presenters rejoin the room. It looks like this might work, so please hold on. And just so you all know, we'll be having Elon Musk stream in via RTMP, so that should be a much better experience. So please hang on for that. Don't lose hope.
If I'm heard by anybody now, looks like I am.
Hey, I
Hey,
hear you.
Tory, welcome back.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, this platform was not developed by ULA, so it doesn't have your 100% reliability.
Well, we're doing okay anyway.
Okay, we're back. And you were talking, I assume, because that's the slide. I lost your audio too pretty early. You were talking about the Vulcan Centaur. We still see that slide.
Ah, okay. Well, I'll move along quickly. I was just sharing that our new chariot to Mars would be Vulcan Centaur. This is to scale, so you can kind of see how it compares to the Atlas. Much larger than the Atlas, a little bit larger in diameter than a core from the Delta IV.
Presenters, if you would please try unmuting your mics again. And let's see. Okay, Tory, we have you now. Matt,
How's
could you
that?
please unmute your mic and rejoin us?
Excellent.
Yes, I apologize.
Great.
I
Thank you
didn't
very
even
much.
notice
No
that
problem.
had happened.
It's not your fault.
Okay. All right. We'll take your word for it. Tory,
All
third
right.
time's a charm.
All right. You got it. Last chart, I promise. Just because it's always fun to see hardware. Up there in the upper left, that's a Delta, a Vulcan, and an Atlas core all lined up in a row going down the big central aisleway in Decatur. So we call it, the Great Hall of Rockets there. There's a little bit of scale effect by the perspective, but you kind of can see that big Delta with the nose cone. And certainly you can see how much bigger a Vulcan core is than an Atlas. In the center of the page, that is a BE-4 engine that we received about a month ago that we're using to pathfind operations. But the funny thing about space launch is it's only partly about the rocket. It's also about the launch pad. So over on the right is a brand new mobile launch platform. That's the thing that says ULA on it. It's much larger to hold that big Vulcan rocket. To the left, you kind of see platforms because it's inside our building called the Spock that we were just using for assembly of this thing, but then we decided to turn it into kind of like a mini VIF. So that's why it's getting platforms. In the center is the world's largest shower. That is the part of the acoustic water suppression system that goes down inside the flame trench, because this thing is so big and powerful and so loud that when it goes off, if we did not spray water to absorb sound energy, it would literally damage the spacecraft sitting 22 stories high above that inside the payload fairing. And off to the left, that's what the whole pad looks like. There's methane tank farms that have been added. There's new oxygen tanks because Centaur 5 is so gigantic that the liquid oxygen farm that supported Centaur 3 isn't even big enough anymore. So it's all coming together, and we're going to fly this big beast next year. And our first mission is to the moon with a robotic lander for Astrobotic that will begin all of that cool research that will very soon afterwards get people there, and then after that, people to Mars.
And that's
with that, I'm out of slides.
Thank you. We made it. And that's that Peregrine lander that you had up. And I think your very first slide, right? The beginning of a whole new era of commercial lunar payloads going to our satellite, the moon.
Yes, that's very exciting, and a new thing in our industry that is kind of unprecedented is these actual commercial missions, some on behalf of NASA, but really commercial missions out, to the moon.
I got to say again, what an honor it was to visit the ULA facility. Indicator, there's that shot, and stand as these behemoths were being put together. Absolutely amazing. And to be able to walk along the Vulcan line as well and see that brand new line of rockets coming together to build on this reputation. I have another thing to thank you for, Tory, and that is, of course, that one of those successful Atlas V launches took our Light Sail 2 into the low Earth orbit, actually medium Earth orbit, that it is still in right now. So all of us at the Planetary Society, including my boss, the science guy, we sure are grateful for that ride.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you for trusting us with your payload.
With this emphasis on going beyond low Earth orbit, and for that matter, geosynchronous orbit, where you guys have so much experience, I think that showing us that commercial mission, taking the Peregrine lander to the moon, that's just the start. There's so much more ahead of us as we look out toward the red planet. And I know ULA's business is largely going to continue to be in Earth orbit. But what else can we look forward to from ULA as we look beyond that?
Oh, well, we absolutely are going to be a part of this first Artemis program. You know, the Peregrine lunar lander is just the first. We are currently competing for the human lander that is that other part of that architecture in that slide. We're on 2 of the 3 teams. We're hoping to make it to the finish point, but there's going to be many, many commercial logistics missions that support that Gateway space station and all of these missions to the surface. So Vulcan will play a big role in that. But what's even more exciting for me is what continues to happen in cislunar space, even after that is set up and we're beginning our human missions to Mars. We're going to continue developing cislunar space and harvesting natural resources from the moon and the near-Earth objects that are within easy reach of that region of Earth orbit. And you will see a self-sustaining cislunar economy with, more than 1,000 people living and working there permanently, permanent habitation off the Earth.
Very exciting. We've had a number of questions come through. I don't think, partly because of our technical difficulties, for which we apologize again, I don't think we have a lot of time left, but I do have a question here, and I think that this is from one of Janet Ivy's young students in India, Tapaswini Sharma, who has asked, Tory, do you think competition in the space industry leads to better innovations? Because
I do.
You're not. Go ahead.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So competition is healthy for the industry. It's good for the customers. You can't always have it. You have to have enough of a market to sustain at least 2 companies so that you can have 2 people competing. There has to be a little bit of an opportunity to differentiate yourself. In other words, the 2, 3, 4 companies need to provide something that's a little bit different from one another, or it's hard to choose, and it's not a healthy competitive environment. But in space, we now have those conditions. And so we have multiple US providers, we have multiple providers around the world, and that allows us to make investments, to develop new technologies, to have different people trying different things. That's how you get innovation and how you are able to try different solutions to eventually figure out what is the best. And right now, we have big challenges: going to the moon, going to Mars with people, dealing with space no longer being an entirely peaceful environment. And it's good for our country and good for the world to have a broader, more robust industrial base when we face challenges like that.
I got just one more for you, Tory, and that is why we're all here today. This was enabled by sponsors like ULA, the United Launch Alliance. And not the first time, I think, that ULA has been a major sponsor of H2M. I just want to ask you what I'm asking some of the other sponsors representatives. Why is the support of events like this important to ULA?
Oh, absolutely. Great question. Because we only do these amazing things, going to Mars, because the public sees value in it. And how can they possibly do that if we're not here to answer their questions and share with him with all of them what the technology is and what the opportunity is in doing this great human endeavor? So it's vitally important. Without forums like this and the support of the public, none of these missions will happen.
Thank you, Tory. Great time to spending a few minutes with you. In spite of those technical difficulties, I think your very important and fairly inspiring message came across. I wish all of you at ULA equally successful launches into the future, and it doesn't get much better than the record that you guys have built. And thank you for being a part of the 2020 H2M Summit.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be here.
That's Tory Bruno, the CEO for 6 years now of United Launch Alliance, leading its incredibly successful record of launches and all of the other support that he spoke about that is provided on the ground. You know, we think of ULA, you think of rockets. There's so much more happening, including, my goodness, building clean rooms